I'm Komi from the Republic of Komi. I'm chair of the Arctic Youth Network Board of Directors, and I'm a PhD researcher at the Arctic Center of the University of Groningen. And today I will be moderating the discussion. So the webinar is organized by the Indigenous Peoples Working Group within the structure of the Arctic Youth Network that we launched recently in cooperation with the Arctic Center. So, and I'm happy to welcome everyone here. We have a very essential topic to discuss, and we have 4 speakers today. So we have Sara Olsvig, chair of Inuit Circumpolar Council. Sorry, I have note here, not to forget the details. Welcome, Sara. Thank you for joining us today. We have Jamal Shili, Director of Research and Innovation, the Nunavut Research Institute. Welcome, Jamal. We have Varvara Korkina-Williams. She's commanding scholar from Siberia, Arctic Innovation Fellow at the Institute of Arctic Studies, project manager at Indigenizing Arctic Research Project, and co-chair on the research priority team on sustainability within AYIP fourth process. And we have Sean Desjardins, assistant professor at the Arctic Center, University of Groningen. So welcome. Before we start, our first hour of the webinar, we prepared list of questions for our speakers, so it will be a moderated discussion. In the last 30 minutes of our discussion, we suggest you guys who joined us today for to listen, to ask your questions. You can ask them raising your hand or just writing the question in your chat. Also, I want to remind you some essential rules about Zoom conferences for keeping this event cool and comfortable for everyone. So first of all, please keep your mics muted until Q&A session. And when the Q&A session is announced, also please, if you want to ask a question, raise your hand. And then I'll ask you out, ask you to turn on your mic and ask your question. And check your name in Zoom if you have name and surname. It would be more convenient for me if you have your hand raised, then I just can ask you by your name instead of saying like, yeah, you have your raised hand there, but you don't have the name. So it would be convenient for all of us. So yeah, and let's start. Just please don't forget to mute
I'm trying to
your
create
mic. Someone is talking. Is there a question? Okay. So let's start. I suggest our first round of questions will be more related to what our speakers do to their activity. And my first question here is prepared for Sara. One of the primary guiding document regulating the inclusion of Inuit communities in research, policymaking, and dialogue in general is ICC Equitable and Ethical Engagement Protocol that we also can share in the chat so people can check it. Could you please introduce the protocol to the audience and explain why paying attention to this protocol is significant from the perspective of research ethics?
Yes, Royanak, and welcome everyone. It's nice to see you. I see there's a lot of Inuit from Gadashnet too, so very nice to meet you here on this chat and everyone else, of course, or this webinar and everyone else, of course. Thank you for the introduction and also for the invitation for us to present our equitable and ethical engagement protocols. Inuit Circumpolar Council, as a big Indigenous peoples organization, we work in 4-year terms. And in the previous term, running from 2018 to 2022, our delegates, who all represent rights holder organizations and civil society, our parliaments and so forth, at the General Assembly in 2018 directed our then leadership to work on protocols to be used within research based on the experiences of Inuit on the ground in terms of meeting researchers time and time again, being situated and in a situation where the knowledge produced did not come back to our communities, where our own knowledge as Inuit was not quoted or cited or in any way sort of reflected in terms of also being part of the knowledge production that researchers were doing, having experiences in terms of also data being used without our consent. And just generally through the decades of colonization, experiencing and knowing the consequences that also comes with researchers coming into our homelands doing research without the full respect for our rights or our culture and so forth. So it was a very clear direction from the ICC delegates in 2018 to work on a document that we could be using in the encounters with researchers, and through a long process, our previous leadership conducted first of all seminars. This was then the time of the COVID, so much of the work was done online successfully. So a series of seminars with people from the ground across Inuit Nunat in both Chukotka, Alaska, Gadaslu Nunat, and Canada. And came up with 8 protocols. And those are the ones you will see in the 42-page long document. It's a quite long document. But basically, the protocols are 8 very important perspectives and steps to take as researchers to reach a point of good governance in the way that research is done. First of all, of course, to do nothing about us without us. That's a slogan or a saying that we hear many, many places. It's also the government of Greenland's slogan in terms of its foreign policy. It's used by persons with disabilities in their work in the UN for many decades. And it's a true slogan, it's a true saying to have the perspective of doing nothing about us without us. Basically always engaging with Inuit and not just approach Inuit as the subject matter of research, but actually as partners that are actively involved in the research that you want to do. Secondly, recognize Indigenous knowledge in its own right. And we in this document also built on the work that ICC and other permanent participants had already done in the Arctic Council to have a shared framework definition. I want to call it a framework definition because our definitions might be different from people to people or even from community to community. Have a framework definition of what we see Indigenous knowledge as being, and then, of course, recognizing it not as something that needs to be affirmed by other people's systems and other people's knowledge systems, but something that is recognized in its own right. Third, of course, also, as I said, practice good governance. And that means that researchers do implement and base their own way of conducting themselves on the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, do not cross borders that sort of would also be violations of the rights of Indigenous peoples. This is back to also how you use the knowledge and how Inuit are taking part in the decision making on areas where we have to take part as we are the people of our own region. Fourth, of course, also to communicate with intent. One thing that I know a lot of researchers have taken from these protocols is the part of the protocol 4 that talks about listening more than you speak. Especially here in Gadaslu Nunat, we often meet people from outside, especially Europeans, sometimes also people from North America, who speak quite a lot more than we do ourselves. And quite often you can be caught in those situations where you are asked to be part of a research project, but you never really get anything said because those foreigners who come with a different mindset and a different culture and are very vocal often. So it needs to be written down in these kinds of protocols to have a focus on also to be able to listen to those that you meet around Inuit Nunat. Fifth protocol is about exercising accountability and building trust. And the sixth protocol is to build meaningful partnerships The seventh is about information and data sharing, ownership and permissions. Again, a very complex area, also in terms of the research that is done, for example, on health, on other areas where data is a very sort of substantive part of the research. How do you ensure when the different nations, first of all, have very different legislation around data, or some don't even have legislation around research and data? How do you then ensure that you don't violate the rights of indigenous peoples? So those are some of the things that are included here. And finally, the eighth protocol is to equitably fund Inuit representation and knowledge. And this is, of course, because we are few in numbers. We don't have the big research budgets as many of the big research sectors come into the Arctic with, especially, for example, climate research and other areas of research. We see the massive invasion kind of researchers from abroad who come here, and it's difficult for us to match it. Even if we want to take part, often we don't have the capacity or the funding. So these are the 8 protocols that I briefly wanted to present to you, and just also add that we are now actively implementing these protocols. Now that we've taken over since 2022 in this current leadership, we're very, very happy to see that, for example, the University of Groningen, Olsvig is basing their work on a new set of ethical guidelines within research on ICC's EEEs, partly, and also, for example, that the government here in Groningen, when working on a new legislation on research, are also looking to the EEEs. And finally, I want to draw your attention also to ICC's currently published position paper on the Arctic Council, where we have further built on our equitable and ethical engagement protocols in coming up with 6 recommendations and areas of recommendations on how to make the processes within the Arctic Council more consistent with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and also applying some of these protocols in terms of how things are done governance-wise and research-wise in the Arctic Council. So this document is out there to live, and hopefully will be used and applied by everyone, indigenous and non-indigenous, in terms of making sure that we all reach a better common understanding of what research does and is. And for me, it's also very important to keep reminding ourselves that research, as it has been historically, has been one of the tools in colonization, and therefore we have a big task ahead of us to turn research around, to no longer letting it be a tool for gaining knowledge about a people that someone else from outside of our homelands want to have some kind of a certain power relationship to, but rather to have it turned around and make it research from within our own communities and our own worldviews, and make sure that we also have knowledge and perspectives on the table that comes from our own value systems and so on. And this is hopefully a good tool to push in that direction for everyone. Brianna, I'll keep it at this.
Thank you, Sara. Yeah, we've sent the link to the protocol in the chat. So everyone who's interested in the protocol, you guys can go to the chat and use the link, look through the document. I think it might be handy. It's a great case. So I suggest we move to our next speaker, Jamal Shirley. I have a question for you, because you're also related to research related to Inuit people. So how does Nunavut Research Institute ensure the ethics of the research conducted in Nunavut? Because I think it's also a great case of how you implement, reassure that the research is ethical and people are included in the research.
Thanks for that question. First off, I'm very honored to be able to contribute to this important discussion and to meet so many new faces. As the director of the Nunavut Research Institute based at Nunavut Arctic College in Nunavut, one of my core responsibilities is to administer research licensing under a territorial legislation called the Scientists Act, which requires that people conducting academic research in the health, natural, and social sciences disciplines obtain a license from the Institute. And the licensing process is well integrated within Nunavut's co-management regulatory regime that was established under the Nunavut Land Claims Agreement. And one of our important responsibilities is to ensure that researchers entering our territory or planning to conduct research in Nunavut are aware of their legal requirements under the Land Claims Agreement to obtain necessary approvals and permissions from the co-management institutions, Inuit land owning bodies, and other regulatory authorities before they conduct their research. So we spend a lot of time just communicating the requirements for responsible research in Nunavut that involves at its bare minimum respecting Nunavut's regulatory laws and requirements. For the research projects that are licensed by the Institute, we have a minimum entry requirement that applicants provide some proof of ethical competence. And typically this would be an assurance from their host institution's research ethics board that they are accountable ethical researcher according to the disciplinary standards of their research. Our review in Nunavut of those applications delves into a more regional Nunavut-specific lens that assesses their preparedness, their experience, the resources that they bring to conduct research in Nunavut, the value and merit of the research. Is it potentially duplicative, disruptive of existing initiatives in our territory? We look at a whole suite of potential considerations that institutional research boards outside of the territory with no or minimal Inuit participation might overlook, but are extremely relevant to ensuring ethical research conduct in our territory. Our review of applications is consultative and involves Tungavik Incorporated, who we defer to for guidance on implementation of the new National Inuit Strategy on Research. We work with regional Inuit authorities, community groups. These are the Hamlet Councils and Hunters and Trappers organizations in communities that are to be impacted by or engaged in a research project to conduct a consultative evaluation of a research plan according to various criteria that I can go into in further detail later, but ultimately to ensure that proposed research is not going to result in harm. And it's often difficult to define what a harm could it potentially entail without having that clear direction and insight from the people in the communities most directly engaged in research. At the Research Institute, we only have 2 staff that process from between 150 to 200 research applications annually across all disciplines. So we rely intimately on this feedback and engagement with our network of stakeholders and partners throughout the territory to ensure that research proposed is ethically sound. Where our process is flawed and weak, I would say, is the fact that we can only review what is planned, proposed, presented, and even though we can go through a long iterative process, we have up to a full year under our legislation from when an application is received until when a license must be issued. And within that lengthy time period, we can facilitate accommodation, changes, modification to a proposal to address concerns and answer questions and to mitigate potential risks and harms and maximize benefits. But once the license is issued, and it could include whatever terms and conditions we've deemed appropriate, we rely entirely on the integrity, the trustful worthiness, and the respect of the researcher in the field to carry out their research according to the parameters that have been set through this licensing process. We do not have a fleet of research police in every community to enforce compliance with research permits. And in fact, it is incredibly difficult to investigate, identify, validate potential research misconduct or infractions, and to hold research accountable through the licensing process. So that's a major limitation in the licensing process as a tool for ensuring and reassuring, as you say, research ethics. And maybe I'll stop there for now. But thanks again for this opportunity to contribute.
Thank you, Jamal. I suggest we move to a bit to an international perspective with our next speaker, Varvara. Varvara is actively involved in the process of AYIP conference. I think Varvara can give this full name of the conference. I don't know what it means. I don't remember. Sorry. But how is Indigenous knowledge meaningfully included in the framework of this process, and what measures are taken or should be taken, maybe to your mind, to ensure that this knowledge is used appropriately with full respect for Indigenous rights, cultural context, and intellectual sovereignty?
Thank you so much, Znochter. And thank you for inviting. I see a lot of familiar names or faces in the audience, and I'm happy to talk after Sara and actually continue and kind of say that ICC Triple E protocol. I think that our project and our work is successful stories of implementing this protocol, to be honest. International Conference on Arctic Research Priorities, or AYIP 4 process, is a conference or process is to set up Arctic research priorities for next 10 years for all of us. And I think it's a very important process in terms of how do we shape as researchers or Indigenous knowledge holders our future. And in 2.5 years ago, our team, which is led by Deli Sambodoro, who is a former ICC chair, and Andrei Petrov, who is a co-host for AYIP 4 conference in Boulder, Colorado, at Arctic Science Summit Week in March 2025. Matthew Drunkemiller, who is a host for this conference, and Tatiana, the guy, she's a Itaman scholar and professor at the University of Victoria, and Melody Birkins, she's a director of the Institute of Arctic Studies here at Dartmouth. So we came together to see how we can influence AYIP 4 process, because previously AYIP involved Indigenous peoples through work with ICC, Sami Council, and International Inuit Association. And of course, this is what Sara already mentioned. We have limited capacity as Indigenous peoples, right? And Indigenous organizations are very powerful force, but at the same time, it's not always in their capacity to engage in research as much as it needed sometimes, and we will probably talk about it later, right? How huge is the demand from Indigenous, demand from research community to Indigenous communities, and how do we navigate it? So we thought about it, and idea was to create a capacity and create a mechanism how Indigenous knowledge holders, Indigenous researchers can participate in this process. So we held several informal dialogues with Indigenous peoples across the Arctic. We were online, and then we basically asked if Indigenous peoples and Indigenous scholars, individuals want to participate in ICAR process, if they think it's important, if they think it's important and need to be addressed. We received an answer that yes, they want to participate, and we also got support from ICC and Sami Council and the EAA. I am telling the whole process because I think it's important that we didn't start a research project from whatever our ideas were at this point, but rather ask communities first, ask people first, and then we received the NNA Navigating New Arctic seeding grant or incubator grant to create this capacity and participate in ICAR Pro process. We continue to have meetings with Indigenous knowledge holders and researchers through different Arctic events. And then during those events, we decided that we need to influence ICARP meaningfully, and I wrote it in a bold, equal partnership, right? That this is what Sara was talking about. It's not only how Indigenous knowledge can be respected or how it could be protected, but basically what we our participants, and we have 100+ members in our network. Demand was that we need to be equal partners. We need to be presented, and Indigenous knowledge is Indigenous science, and it is a knowledge system. It's not a part of something, but it's a whole system which has to be presented on its own, and we need to work on knowledge co-production, but as equal partners. So, and then we wrote a letter to International Steering Committee of ICARP for process, demanding, yeah, I think it was demand, respectful though, of course, to have an Indigenous co-chair of this process. So we ended up, so now we have Indigenous co-chair. This is a daily Sambadoro, who leads International Steering Committee along with Henry Burgess. We also have research priority teams. There are 7 research priority teams, and in 4 of them we have Indigenous co-chairs. And I think that is a step which needed to show that our knowledge system and our Indigenous researchers are same valuable as Western science and the Western scientists. Yes, when we are talking about ICARP 4, and now we are working, each research priority team works on their own. So, and we hope that our Indigenous members of these priority teams will write priorities together as a part of the process. But also we will have ICARP 4 Summit in March in Boulder, and now there is a IASC and UArctic funding calls, so early career scholars and Indigenous participants can apply for it. and registration is open. So the idea also to have as many sessions and as many discussions as we can. So, and then all these notes and results of this summit will be submitted to research priority teams, and we can again revisit it. And I think it's important to bring as many Indigenous young people to Boulder as well, so we can influence it by having discussions. So, and I hope that all attendees will apply.
Yeah, thank you, Varvara, for such a detailed description of the process. I think it's a very valuable experience and a great job that you're doing there. So when we were organizing this webinar, we tried to invite speakers with different experiences to find the balance between Indigenous and non-Indigenous researchers and representatives of the Indigenous communities and non-Indigenous researchers who are involved into the process in the research with Indigenous peoples. So yeah, my next question is to Sean. As a non-Indigenous researcher who works a lot with Inuit people in Canada, what ethical considerations guide your work in Inuit communities, and how do you ensure that collaboration remains respectful and mutually beneficial?
Thank you very much, Olga, and thanks so much to the whole panel. It's such an honor to be here, and I hope I'm able to add something to this really important discussion. I am a settler, non-Indigenous researcher. I've been working across the North, particularly in Nunavut, for quite some time, more than a decade. And I think from my perspective, my own approach to the anthropological, archaeological research that I do has changed quite a bit, certainly quite a bit more than when I was being sort of trained in working in the field. The folks the generations above me, I'm 42. That's how old I am. I can't quite remember how old I am, but the still considered early career by some standards. But the folks who were in the generations above me, these conversations were being had around meaningful research, ethical engagement in research, but they weren't as visible as they are now. So a lot of folks had to sort of learn about these things on their own. And I would say that my research has changed in some fundamental ways over the last decade. First of all, the kinds of questions that I am interested in engaging with are quite different. They're formulated with community members, with local knowledge keepers and rights holders today. And the way in which the research is formulated and carried out is certainly different as well. I've been really inspired by fellow Indigenous and non-Indigenous researchers to kind of change my perspective on what I'm doing when I'm trying to build knowledge in my work in the North. I see my role now less as a sort of independent researcher than as a kind of facilitator for helping to, as much as I can, work with people to build knowledge, facilitating the kinds of research questions that the local rights holders find most interesting and would like to see developed. And this type of engagement is not easy, nor should it be. It takes time and often a significant amount of funding. And I definitely encourage all researchers to do what Sara suggested and others have suggested, which is to first and foremost listen and to really learn about what Indigenous rights holders have outlined for us. Both ICC, the protocols for equitable and ethical engagement, have been are incredibly important. As in Canada as well, ITK, Inuit Tupierek Kanatami, has released their national Inuit strategy for research, and this there are some incredibly important recommendations for how we need to carry out our work as researchers. One of the big problems for us, though, is that the systems around research are not built for this type of meaningful engagement, and these are concerns that are directly outlined in both of the two important documents I just mentioned. And by system, I'm talking about funding agencies that fund research, which is incredibly expensive in the North, but also the research institutions themselves, the universities and museums that fund so much research, and government agencies, not always properly facilitating the time that it takes to meaningfully co-create research. You need to spend time in community, engaging with people. Sometimes this can take quite a long time to build relationships and to build trust. And if there's one thing that funding agencies and others within this system don't like, it's things that take a lot of time. They want output. They want certain types of output that are not always necessarily the types of research outputs that are going to be the most interesting or meaningful for local rights holders. So, and also understanding that there are, different types of important research output that are not always going to benefit only academia, for example. So, yeah. From my perspective, it's incredibly important now to listen, to learn more about what has been outlined for researchers, and to do our best to continue to move forward to ensure that the work is as equitably created and that the data is equitably managed as possible. And also, very importantly, to another point that was mentioned by Sara, is that the work is not only co-created and co-managed, but that anything that is developed outside of community is brought back to community. And so, again, often this involves face-to-face time in communities with people. So this is another reason why partly a lot of the research engagements that we carry out are expensive, logistically difficult, but absolutely necessary to really doing meaningful work.
Thank you, Sean. And I should mention that you're not just facilitating to Indigenous communities, but you're also educating next generation of researchers who work with Indigenous communities, teaching at the university and having PhD students. So it was the first round of the discussion. I suggest we move from the first round directly to the third round of the questions that I have, because for the second round of the discussion, I had this general question about definition of ethical research, but I think our speakers already gave the answer to this question in their answers to the first round of questions. So I suggest we move to more interesting questions that I have here, that we worked out with our team in the working group and at the Arctic Center. So my next question is for Varvara and Sara. Based on your experience and observations, how does research made by Western scientists on Indigenous lands challenge the communities living there from an ethical perspective? And what should be done or considered by Western scientists in order to overcome these challenges and make their research mutually beneficial and respectful for both scientists and indigenous communities living in the research areas? Could you give some recommendations or tips from your perspective? I don't know. I see Varvara on my screen. Maybe you could start and then Sara could follow you. I'm sorry, I do not see Sara on my screen.
I see Sara. Actually, I would love Sara to start based on
Okay.
our cultural traditions. So
Yeah. Okay.
Well, thank you so much for the very important question. And it is a very big question and full of dilemmas, I would like to say. And I think that you know, if I take the last part first, is to be constantly critical and listen to yourself. If it feels wrong, it quite obviously there's something wrong. So if you are in a research group, which I have also experienced many times, and you're the only Inuk, you're the only indigenous person, it can feel very wrong in many ways. And you can also be caught in a situation where things sit around the table just feels as another sort of colonialistic violation on you personally or collectively, depending on how you also receive as an individual different kinds of perspectives and how you perceive different kinds of perspectives in doing your own research. I'm also a researcher and I have been in those situations quite a few times. If we go back to your first questions, it is also included in ICC's equitable and ethical engagement protocols, that dilemma of some research being done in the name of someone else's greater good. So, for example, there can be some research within natural sciences that from which the results may be used against us. This could be on different species that is used in management. The research may be produced on these different species that we live from and hunt without the inclusion of indigenous knowledge. And our hunters along the coast in Galashinunaat and elsewhere will say, but this knowledge that has been produced doesn't take into account our knowledge. But still, the numbers, the data from that research will be used in the management of the hunt. So it can be some of the very big and sometimes quite worrying concerning geoengineering projects that are being, drawn on a desk somewhere long way away from the Arctic, and then they are brought to the Arctic, and the research group that brings this, and this is also something we've experienced in ICC, will approach us and say, you need to accept and okay, tick okay for this project because it's in the name of the greater good for the planet and the humanity that we use your fjord to test a certain kind of geoengineering to see if we can slow down the melting of the glacier of that fjord. And we can sit there saying, well, it's going to ruin the whole ecosystem for a whole area of Galashinunaat. So we are very concerned, but the research group will continue to use the argument that this is in the name of a greater good, which would then supersede, in their point of view, the rights of those indigenous peoples who live from the resources in that fjord. So that's another example that has actually happened in real life. Adding to that is that some of these research groups will then have a high degree of power in terms of being able to speak to big newspaper outlets in the US, in Denmark. And again, a very concrete example that I have without mentioning the concrete research project, but a research project where we had experienced this kind of an approach to us was then portrayed in the so-called hopeful news in Danish media with not one single quote from one single Inuk in terms of whether that would have been a good research geoengineering project or not. So as you see, these things are still full of unequal power relations, and they are also still full of extremely big dilemmas. And I think the only way that we can get beyond that is that everyone around the table take responsibility to question this existing system, and also have the courage to have a systemic change to how research is conducted, how it's led, how the power relations are, and how you conceive what is co-production. Co-production, does that mean that we cannot produce ourselves? We have to co-produce with someone else so that it is, viable outside of our own homeland? Or can we also come back to the production coming from our own societies and perspectives and knowledge systems, and then that is valued just as highly as any other production? So again, coming back to your last question, is to constantly have that critical point of view within yourself. If it feels wrong, it quite certainly most probably has something wrong in it, and we recognize that as Indigenous peoples because of our history, and because we do see when something is wrong. We know it because we've been through a very long history of different kinds of systemic inequities, and we are good at spotting them. So I hope that is answering your question, Røena.
Yes, thank you. Barbara, do you have something to add?
Sure. So I fully support Sarah's points, and probably I would not add more about how it can be challenging and sometimes harmful, and geoengineering, of course, and then hunting. And for example, in Alaska, same as in Russia, in Kamchatka, then scientists do research on some species and decide that it's like extincting species or a salmon, and then they prohibit to harvest salmon, for example, in Yukon River, right? Saying that we need not to touch it for whatever years. We do not consider our knowledge system, our cultural identity, and also not even that, but also that we must have our traditional food, right? So and with subsistence economy, there are a lot of examples about how Western scientists consider better cause or better future and sacrifice Indigenous rights and Indigenous ways of living. So my answer, how we can do better, actually, we need to elevate Indigenous knowledge system and Indigenous science and Indigenous knowledge holders to see it as a valuable, equal knowledge system. So as its own, and then co-production will be something mutual and beneficial, but not as a integrated knowledge, or like some part of which again will be seen, and I see it a lot, unfortunately. Then we kind of trying to take any like positive or something that from Indigenous knowledge system, something good, because they say nature-based solutions, right, that will save our planet for the future, and they use it for geoengineering, for example, science, but they don't want to listen to our voices when they say like, oh no, we should not do it in a fjord, right? So that is an answer that we need to consider a whole system, not only like little pieces which fits into science theories, or like, when so that's why we need to have a equal partnership. For equal partnership, we need to change institutions again, because what we see now, project-based approaches to. I'm sorry, I always smile when I see children. He's so cute. So we need the institutional change, because now we have all our projects related to indigenous knowledge system. It's soft money, and it's on the outskirts of existing projects, and we need a systematic support and our own institutions, our own funding, so we can meaningfully and equally participate in research, because now it's like little pieces and not as equal as it should be. Thank you.
Thank you, Varvara. Thank you, Sara, for such a substantive answer. I'm wondering if Sean and Jamal have something to add to this question. If no, I have a separate question for you two guys. So, well, I suppose no. So my question to Sean and Jamal is, how can non-Indigenous researchers best support Indigenous-led research? So,
Yeah, I could start with that if you don't mind, Sean.
Great, thank you.
That's a wonderful question, and it follows on the very powerful and valuable words that were shared by Sara and Varvara. But I think just from my experience and observation in Nunavut, I think one of the key essential steps now to support genuine Indigenous Inuit-led research in Inuit is for the non-Indigenous research community to provide space for that research to develop on its own terms, and to recognize that in Nunavut now there are many Inuit community-based research champions that are leading very excellent research programs that are involve some partnerships or collaboration with external researchers, and then other instances are entirely independent. But I think the continued influx and the need to accommodate requests and involvement from external non-Indigenous research can sometimes put a lot of pressure and present challenges for Indigenous-led researchers who have to wear multiple hats, being the advisor and facilitator and supporter of other non-Indigenous research, while at the same time trying to develop their own research programs and partnerships on their terms. So I think an acknowledgement of the need to not necessarily pursue every research opportunity that becomes available, and recognizing that priority should absolutely be given to Indigenous existing and new research initiatives, and acknowledging as well that there is a growing kind of frustration with the perception of duplicative, redundant research in our communities, and that I think new research questions that may seem compelling or interesting before a research proposal is submitted, that we really need to do a better job of investigating what has already been studied, what research, what information has been gathered, and seriously question whether new investigations are absolutely needed in every instance where a research funding opportunity could become available. And on the topic of funding, I think it's interesting that the challenge of transforming research funding mechanisms to be more equitable and inclusive can have unintended negative consequences that can, in fact, discourage genuine relationship building. And I give the example of the requirement that some new, certain new research funding programs have for Indigenous partnerships at the letter of intent stage, which in Nunavut's example prompted a flurry of last-minute requests, some over social media, for Inuit to sign on as partners to research projects that they had no prior involvement or experience with. And this type of kind of co-opting local engagement and providing and token inclusion of Inuit and community interests to advance academic research objectives is really still a major challenge for the research governance process in Nunavut. And I think it's one that needs to be carefully addressed in future research funding program design. But I think there are numerous kind of practical, respectful, ethical practices that early career or established researchers could adopt or implement to work better and more meaningfully in Nunavut. But I think I'll pass the torch to Sean for his thoughts and join the conversation later with some of those ideas.
Yeah, thank you, Jamal. I mean, there's nothing really more that I can add. This is than to what you've talked about, and I agree that I mentioned the funding schemes, and Varvara mentioned the need to make structural what is now a lot of soft money that's available for Indigenous led projects in a lot of communities, and that's absolutely something that needs to happen. But I agree that reforming those funding structures is not easy, because right now the big national funding structures in a lot of countries are designed for universities, museums, big national funding agencies don't have communities or community-led initiatives necessarily in mind. So there needs to be more recognition of local expertise on an institutional level. So, for example, a national funding agency should recognize an elder or a knowledge keeper as a PI or a co-PI of a project, for example. Also, the question of research infrastructure needs to be addressed, and researchers need to work beyond regulatory minimums and not just sort of meet what the permitting or the regulatory sort of system demands of them. And this also, again, speaks to needing institutions to kind of have a change in culture to recognize that it will take longer for more meaningful projects that are, it'll take longer for those projects, for the trust to be built, for the relationships to be established, and for the output to really fully develop so that it's equitable and everybody is satisfied. So, yeah, I think it was both Sara and Varvara mentioned that there is it's a structural issue that needs to change, and that's going to take some time. But I'm heartened by the fact that, again, as I mentioned earlier, these conversations are more frequent, and they're certainly occurring more than they did when I was a graduate student who had no exposure to all of these discussions. So I'm hopeful moving forward.
Thank you, Jamal. Thank you, Sean, for your answers. Sara, Varvara, do you have something to add on this question, maybe, or their answers were comprehensive?
I can only quote Sara actually about that in terms of the structural change and what we can do, and speaking to many Indigenous early career professionals here, and maybe someone will watch it online. And I was trying, and Sara told us one day, like, you need to write because until it's not published, it does not exist. So, and I think that another question, of course, not only like funding, but also peer-reviewed publications and how we write about on the Indigenous knowledge, or how we write as an Indigenous scholar. Because for me and my former advisor always say how he doesn't like then I talk about it. But for me, it took 7 years to graduate with master's degree because science was not there. I couldn't explain why is it like that in Western science, because I just know, right? So you just know. And until like 2022, when I was able to write this preamble and saying like why this research has this design, whom I talked, and blah blah blah, it was not possible like even like 5 years ago. And I'm hopeful too that we will develop better science for all, not only for Indigenous peoples or for Indigenous communities, but for all. Thank you.
Thank you, Varvara. So I remember that I promised our first hour will be the moderated discussion, and after that we'll have the discussion, the questions from the audience. But I still have one important question to ask. And while I'm asking this question, I want to address everyone who is here today to go to the chat and look through the link, because there are many interesting links, materials for you to look through after the event. Just copy them. And I also want you guys, if you have questions, could you please write them in the chat so we can choose the most interesting questions and ask them after this last question that I have to our speakers. So we gathered today many early career researchers, and I want to ask every speaker to give a recommendation on how we could ensure the ethical aspect of our research regarding Indigenous peoples. Some recommendation on how we early career researchers can ensure that. We already have to listen more, to be constantly critical, and also that we should read through ICC protocol. So something else, maybe? Sara, let's start with you if you're ready.
Well, I think a lot of things have already been said, but I want to reiterate the issue about, being cognizant and constantly aware. Even ourselves, sometimes we are not aware because we are so used to moving around in these networks and realities that have been like that and been like so for decades and centuries, so to speak. So to be aware of those power inequities that we are up against. I just came back from Baku, Azerbaijan, from the COP29, and here we also had a side event we co-organized with the Arctic Council on cryospheric sciences and cryosphere. And as soon as we so in the Arctic we have, as we also hear from around this panel today, we do have some good considerations. We do have some good processes that have been initiated, and we've sort of learned as an Arctic community to support each other in making things better. We don't have to go very far away from the Arctic before we realize, and we might realize, that this is just completely foreign for other people. And especially when we had the cryospheric sciences side event, I was struck by what huge powers we are up against, not just as an Arctic research community, but also as Indigenous peoples globally. So as it has already been said, we need to just continue pushing for a full recognition of Indigenous people's knowledge in its own right, but also bring with it and take the perspective of the human rights that comes with that. because we need to make sure that all research communities who also come from outside the Arctic into our communities and our region are informed of what we want to see happen on the ground. They definitely are not necessarily in the same sort of line of thoughts and processes that we have been successful in creating in the Arctic as a global or sort of as a regional system. So there is still a lot of work to do. And in terms of the COP negotiations, just to get Indigenous knowledge or the knowledge of Indigenous peoples into the text is something that requires us to work very closely with not only the 7 sociocultural regions besides, so 6 others besides the Arctic region in the Global Indigenous Caucus, but also to be able to partner with state delegations who then support us and ally with them strategically to have such recognitions included into UN text. It does not happen on itself, so we have to be there to occupy the space and speak our own truth and our own perspectives. So we just need to get our good shoes on and our all our working clothes on and go to all the venues that we can to push for this collectively. Bueno.
Thank you. Jamal, do you have a recommendation for early career researchers for us?
Sure. Yeah, just to build on Sarah's comments, and I think it's absolutely essential for early career researchers contemplating a new study in an Arctic community, especially in Nunavut, to learn as much as they possibly can about the people and the lived experience of in the communities that they want to conduct research with, and get as full of an understanding as they can of the previous and ongoing research and beyond research, policies, programs, and other initiatives that are related to the research domain they are interested in that are already being implemented and underway in the community, and really determine whether the research that they plan to undertake is, how can it add value to this existing knowledge base and community of practice? How can the new research avoid duplicating, confusing, disrupting, or interfering with what's already underway? And how can they, as outside researchers with skills, knowledge, and interest, add value to the lives of the people that they will be working with? Reach out to research gatekeepers in the territory that can provide that at those more specific direction and advice on how to work respectively and responsibly in individual communities. Our office is an example, Nunavik Incorporated is another for Nunavut, and learn about those practical norms and expectations, protocols, and realities in individual communities that could really influence how and whether you should proceed with research in that community, and also be well resourced. I think one of the biggest concerns that we receive here at the Institute is with respect to early career researchers arriving with shoestring budgets, unable to cover their own basic costs of living, let alone compensate participants fairly for engaging and supporting in their research projects. So adequate research funding in advance of embarking on an in-person research activity in our territory is absolutely essential, because it can really sour a relationship when community members feel they're being misused or taken advantage of by an external researcher, even if that researcher is a student who is just barely getting by. The perception that this is opportunistic and exploitative research can really sour the community's perception of research and their willingness to participate in further studies, and can also undermine Inuit-led research with those same community members who had a negative experience with an external researcher. So those are just a few ideas, but there are again, just to reinforce the need to reach out to the organizations that manage and coordinate research at the regional and local level to gain that advice before embarking on a project.
Thank you, Jamal. I'm reminded that you guys have a chance to ask some meaningful question in the chat. I think we'll still have some time for some questions. So I encourage you to write some questions in the chat. Please use the chance. Varvara, do you have a recommendation for us?
Yes, I do. Okay, I have two. First is a general philosophical one, and I think that as a Indigenous peoples, we have this holistic view, and we know that everything is connected to each other. And my suggestion for early career researchers think, and especially if you are non-Indigenous and you want to work in Indigenous communities, to think about your research is not only being your research, your little thing, but of course you are proud of doing it and it's important to do research, but also think how it contributes to the future of the Arctic and how it all fits. And I think that this idea about thinking a whole picture might be helpful for you. Also, feel maybe more optimistic because then we have a lot of challenges in the future, and especially in the Arctic. We have always geopolitics. Geopolitical powers and climate disaster, so it's quite overwhelming. And another suggestion is more practical. After AYIP 4, there's an International Polar Year, and again, I think I connected to Sara's point about cryosphere, and International Polar Year happens once in 50 years, and it connects two poles. And we have not enough Arctic scientists participating in this process. And because it's going to be in 2032, right? That I think it's 2032. So it's a huge possibility that you are going to be to play a bigger role in International Polar Year. Yeah, it's 2032-33. And there is also in Boulder where will be early career polar summit in March as well. So if you didn't look at this, please do, because there is another opportunity to bring Arctic science to international agenda. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Varvara. Yeah, and I think you should have recommended also not to forget to fill in the application for funding to visit Boulder in March. So, Sean, do you have a recommendation for us?
Sure. These are all excellent recommendations for early career folks. I would say I would echo Jamal's point about working within community. So much of the research as it develops and unfolds is going to be it's going to respond to kind of concerns and interests, et cetera, at the community level. So you need to know the community that you're working at as well as out of, as well as possible. Always for non-Indigenous early career researchers, be aware of your position as a researcher, of the positionality, be aware of the history of research in the community and how it might have affected people in the past. The legacy of the discipline that you're working in often carries a lot of weight with folks. These are not just concerns, obviously, for people who work with Indigenous people directly, people doing the social sciences and the humanities. It's also for biologists and ecologists and other folks, right? They need to be aware of all of these concerns as well. Maintain some flexibility in your research plan because it will change. It will change and it will need to change in response to perhaps concerns in the community or other things, but maintain as much flexibility in your research design as possible. And another excellent point is make sure, as Jamal mentioned, you're well resourced. I was in that position as an early career researcher years ago. People need and must be compensated for their time, their expertise, and that's very important as well.
Thank you, Sean. There are several questions in the chat, and there are some cool events related to the topic. But before we ask that question, meaningful question from the chat, from the audience, I want to remind you all that the event, today's webinar, is organized in the framework of the Indigenous Peoples Working Group launch in the Arctic Youth Network. We launched it recently, and we are actually now in the process of open application process that, we are open for new members for the working group. And you can scan the QR code on the slide here and go to the forum. And if you are interested in in making something meaningful, like, for example, this webinar, you can come to us and work with us as a part of the team and promote your ideas and promote Indigenous people's research ethics, for example. So please use your chance. I think we also will share the QR code not QR code, but the link in the chat. As for the questions, so here we have, I think, 3 questions, as I can see. Thank you, everyone, for asking your questions in the chat. All the questions will copy to the document because we're thinking that we just scratched the surface of this research ethics topic. It's really big. So I think we need to continue these discussions, continue in some forms of webinars, lectures, inviting people for early career researchers to have this access to this knowledge, to the experience of other people. And we'll use these questions that we have in the chat for our future events. I want to ask this question. I think it should be not that long, presumably, and maybe we'll make it even 2 questions. So the question from Elias, sorry if I pronounce it wrong, but the question is, does the ICC or governments of Nunavut and Greenland offer Indigenous knowledge consultants, experts to facilitate, circumvent, solve ethical conflicts in research conduct? If so, is the presence and participation of these consultants enforced by law? I think Sara and Jamal, you could answer these questions. This question.
I can just say very briefly that no, we do not offer consultants, and I think if we did, that would be several years' work for several people to do that. Sorry, I'll give it to Jamal. My son is a bit upset.
Similarly, Nunavut, the territorial government at least does not offer a Indigenous knowledge consulting service to researchers. I think that there are individual knowledge holders who do provide consulting services potentially to researchers, but it's certainly not a service that's offered through, for example, the licensing process for research or any of the other kind of authorizing requirements in Nunavut. But I can definitely understand the need and interest in having that type of a service.
But as I know from my experience that in Nunavut, you do provide some ethical training for researchers who are going to apply for the permits to work there.
You might be referring to a national free research ethics training that's delivered through the Tri-Council. It's called
yes.
The course on research ethics that we require some European research applicants to complete if they do not have a research ethics board in their home institution. So that is a kind of surrogate proof of ethical competence that we would require, but it's not delivered in Nunavut or from an Indigenous perspective. It does have an excellent chapter, like the Tri-Council Policy Statement has a very, very good chapter on conducting ethical research in Indigenous Canadian communities. And it would highly recommend that reading that document and that chapter before contemplating a research project in Canadian Arctic, but it's not a Nunavut specific training program. Nunavut does not have its own territorial research ethics board. We conduct our ethics reviews through our consultation process, but it's largely ad hoc, and it brings together expertise as needed, depending on the research discipline and the project scope. Yeah, I think at this, I'll let Sara finish her comment on this question.
No. Yes, my son is just off for his taekwondo practice and he wanted me to come with him, but I'll run after him as soon as we finish. So in Greenland, we here in Galashinat, Greenland, we actually don't even have a law in terms of research ethics yet, but the Ministry of Statehood and Foreign Affairs are now working on developing a law. And as I mentioned earlier, the Olsvig University here are also now out with their new research ethic guidelines, which are we are very happy from ICC to see that they are also drawing on the triple E's in that work. There is one council, and I'm a member of that council, which is the Council on Research Ethics within Health Research. And that's the only council that does approvals of health, of research projects and gives them such a license to actually operate here. I think that we will see, I did see one of the other questions in the chat, and I do think that we will see in the coming years the discussion on whether purely literature review research, so finding everything online that you can do research on, should also operate only with a license like we see with the health research in terms of Galashinat. So I think that those are things we will need to discuss further in the future, because right now, or basically right now in Galashinat anyway, we do lack legislation on the area. It's only within the health research, and luckily the council that I'm talking about does take a broad approach to what health research is. So it's not only focused around everything that is sort of a medical approach and is about, for example, sampling actual organic materials from humans and so forth. So it's also looking at other sort of more social approaches to health.
Thank you, Sara. So in the remaining 7 minutes, I suggest to go through one more question. There is an interesting question, but we should be very concise with the responses. So the question is, like, academia is often fairly criticized for being difficult to access for the general public. What are the ways to ensure scientific knowledge is properly and accessibly shared with Indigenous communities instead of research only staying within these scientific communities? That is a problem that was raised. And thank you, Tessa, for your question. I think there are some interesting cases that our speakers could share. So, Sean, do you have something?
Yes, thank you. It's a great question, and the question was about academia particularly, correct? Yeah,
Yeah, like how this research can reach the audience.
Yeah, well,
people in the communities.
It's a major problem across the board. I mean, to members of my own family, academia and academic research is often impenetrable and kind of mysterious. And it is the responsibility in the current system of researchers to make sure that that information is contextualized, translated, and given back directly to community members. And this goes back to the question of being, resourced to do the work. You have to be able to have the ability to go to communities, to reach multiple rights holders within communities, to present the work to elders, to students, to members of various traditional governing organizations within the community. So, yeah, it is incumbent upon researchers to make sure that outreach, knowledge utilization, valorization, there are all kinds of different terms for it, but to make sure that it is all accessible and that it is not done and again, going back to the question of working beyond the regulatory minimum, beyond simply sending a report. It goes to something more meaningful than that.
I also remember our recent discussion in the Arctic Center about PhD defense in front of the community that you're writing about. So I suppose that is also an interesting practice that for example, in Nunavut could be used.
Sure.
Since there's a lot of research going. So thank you. Do you guys have something to add, Jamal, Sara, Varvara, about this knowledge outreach to the Indigenous communities?
I would only add the language aspect, and to remember that we are also Indigenous peoples that are not predominantly in an Anglophone area, and that's a big issue here in Galashiq Nunat. And also to have our research communicated in ways that is readable and acceptable to our people, and that really also requires some disciplines within communication and the research sort of research communications. And I think that we as institutions should really be practicing and looking more at how we do that in the best way. And I'm pretty happy to see that the Arctic Hub here in Galashiq Nunat are doing their Basisavut second round of Basisavut sort of tournament of PhD students that is focused on communicating their PhD projects in a way that is understandable for everyone. But the language part is really important, and it also goes from the very beginning of creating a project that you cannot approach a community here in Galashiq Nunat just bringing with you a one-pager in English. That just simply doesn't work. So the language part has to be implemented into the research project right from the beginning. Bueno.
Completely agree, and not only about language as a language which community speaks, but also a way how you communicate. Because, for example, in our community, scientists came and got DNA samples, so they reach back, but it's all written in very heavy language and I don't understand what it means. So the like result is presented, it's published, but it's not written for community to understand. So and that is a simple way of taking time to talk to community and come back. And if you were able to work with community and get data and work on it, so probably you would be able to have even if it's not. And again, I understand that coming back to community to present results might be not within a budget, but it's good to think about it in the beginning. Then you create a budget to have a meeting at the end of the project and present it, but at least do online outreach or some kind of way to have it, to bring it back in a way that each community will understand it. Thank you.
Jamal, do you have something to add?
Just very briefly, I agree with every point that's been raised, especially around the need to provide summary results at minimum in plain language that's suitable for translation into Inuit here, and a caution to that AI translation tools are improving very rapidly, but they're absolutely not 100% accurate for Inuit and Nunavut, and you must work with a human interpreter translator for that service and are working for translating your documents as part of our licensing process. And then finally, for those final definitive academic publications, please publish them in open access forums that aren't hidden behind paywalls that our communities have to pay $50 just to get a copy of the final manuscript describing the research that they supported.
Thank you, Jamal. Thank you to all of you. I think we're 1 minute over our planned time for the webinar. We just scratched the surface. I think we should continue the discussions, and we are planning to reach to everyone with a survey to get some feedback on what we should cover maybe in our next webinars. And thank you, Sara. Thank you, Jamal. Thank you, Sean. Thank you, Varvara, for finding time and joining us and sharing your experience and your opinion. It was valuable, and the discussion was really interesting, and it was it was great. So I think we can finish now, just to continue with our lives. Keep in touch. Bye.